Well, some years ago, Lou Reed sang this song, "It's such a perfect day, I'm glad I spent it with you." And if you look at this song, he includes all kinds of things for his perfect day, such as feeding animals at the zoo, going to a movie, and of course drinking sangria, which is not an option for us. But I wonder if you could have your own perfect day, what would you be doing? Anybody got any ideas? What would you do on a perfect day? Anybody going to share? Are you going to keep it to yourself? Andy, what are you smiling for? What would you do? Watching Wycombe Wanderers win a game. Emmanuel, what would you do?
Praying to God.
Praying to God. Wow. Oh, and Joanna, what would you do on a perfect day?
Singing.
You do singing.
And dancing.
Singing and dancing. Wow, I don't know if any of us would do singing and dancing. Well, I'm sure you've all got your ideas of a perfect day. For me, it would definitely have to involve good coffee, a very tasty Victoria sponge cake, not necessarily in this order, and family, and probably the countryside or the seaside. For you, it will be different. It may involve sports, talking to an old friend, reading a good book. And I think if we were being honest, most of us, when faced with that question, would answer it in a personal pursuit of pleasure. If we ask God what his perfect day would be, I'm sure we would find him saying, "I'm glad I spent it with you." And his day would be one of giving and giving and giving again. And as we look at these few verses from Isaiah 43, we find that they contain 3 verbs describing the actions of God that would make any day for us a perfect day. So in verse 19, he says, "I am doing." Again in verse 19, he says, "I am making." And in verse 20, he says, "I provide." So God is a God who does. It doesn't seem possible, does it, that it's nearly 5 years ago when we began to live through our pandemic. Sometimes we want to close our minds off to it, don't we, because it was so horrendous. They were horrendous days. Yet somehow we coped. We even managed when there was a severe shortage of pasta and toilet rolls. Can you remember those days? We got through that time when we couldn't meet our family, our friends, or get together for worship. We overcame so very, very much in that time with a stoic fortitude that looked the pandemic in the face. But if we think that we managed to do all that in our own might and power, then we were sadly mistaken. Prayer upon prayer was poured out to God that a cure would be found, that the days of the pandemic would be shortened, and that he would pour out his peace, his grace, his mercy and love upon our world. And God heard those prayers and provided again and again and again. For Cliff and myself, during those days, we saw God's provision many, many times. So during the pandemic, we were at Leeds Central, and the plan was during those days that we would just continue to serve the Monday meal. We always did a meal for the homeless on a Monday, and we would just continue. But on that first Monday, when we went to the hall, we realised that there were so many people in Leeds who needed to be fed. And so we then provided meals 5 days a week for, I don't know how many months or years we did it. Absolutely ages. We did over 20,000 meals. And it was amazing, really, how everything came in for those meals. We did have enough money to go and buy, but we were so busy, and we had just 6 people at the start so that we didn't get the virus. We just kept it very small. But I can remember on many occasions, perhaps we'd be running out of coffee and we'd go and do the Morrison's daily trip. And that time we'd get back coffee. Whatever we needed, we would receive. God provided for us. It was a toll on our health, we have to be honest. For those first few weeks, we didn't even have time to sit down and have a coffee, and that was really hard. We just kept going and going. We'd get home we'd serve the meals. On our way home, we'd deliver yet more food parcels. We'd get home, we'd have 1 hour in the garden. We were blessed with a lovely garden. And after that 1 hour, we would start again. We would phone up people. And then we would have to learn how to do online worship. We'd never heard of Zoom, had we? We didn't know how to do anything, and we had to learn how to do that. And I can tell you, we had many arguments, didn't we, Cliff, during those days. But God provided for us again and again, health-wise. It was quite sad in some respects because different restaurants and everything were closing. And I can remember when Debenhams closed, and we were offered as the Salvation Army to go and clear all their shelves. So Cliff went with 3 other people and emptied their freezers and their restaurant. It was sad for them. And so we had so much food given. You also went to, what was it? Not Frankie and Benny's. Yeah, Frankie and Benny's, which again had closed. And this caused more problems because we had all this food and we didn't have enough freezers. We already had 3, but we needed more to store this food. And so we suggested that we would put out on Facebook or to our core, could anybody help us with any empty freezers? We just needed freezer space. Well, I have to confess, I wasn't too happy about this, because in my mind, I'm thinking, well, we could have freezers in Harrogate, we could have freezers all round Leeds, and we just physically could not go and pick up all this food. But do you know, it was absolutely amazing how God provided the freezers in exactly the right places. Our next door neighbour kindly gave us one, and we filled it alone with scones from Debenhams. And I have to confess, I think Cliff and I ate every one of them. We just needed some sustenance, didn't we, Cliff? Campbell Freeman's mum, some of you know Campbell Freeman, his mum lived down the road from us. She had a freezer in her garage. Rothwell Methodist had one, and they kept our cakes. Somebody else had one in Kippax. And it may sound silly, but I believe that God provided all of them in the right places because he knew our limitations. He is an active God. He is a God who provides, and he is a God who does. Cliff has mentioned this before about one of his great aunts. His mum worked 2 jobs when the children were young, and because of that, this lady would take their dirty clothes, she would wash them, she would iron them, and bring them back freshly laundered. And his aunt had been at service at a large estate, and when those clothes were returned, he said that you would have thought they were brand new. They were so beautifully pressed, so neatly folded. And one of the descriptions that used to be used of people like his great aunt was that she was someone who does for rich people. Someone who does. Someone who is active. Someone who is at work. And that is our God who provides for our needs. You know, when we read the Bible, there are so many important questions that we need to ask. But 2 of the most important ones are these. What did this mean to the people of its day? But what also does this speak into our own situation today? And these few verses refer to the Jews as they emerged from exile in Babylon, back to their wanderings in the wilderness, and to their exodus from Egypt. And they were reminded on that journey that they discovered that Yahweh is the God who does. What weapons did the Israelites use to escape from captivity in Egypt? None. It was God who delivered them. How many boreholes did they dig to find a water supply? None. It was God who gave them water and food. What maps did the Israelites follow to negotiate their way through the wilderness? None. It was God who guided them. And the story of that Exodus is a story of a God who saved, a God who delivered, a God who provided, and a God who guided. We have a God who does. Now, we will be ending our meeting today with that great hymn, Praise My Soul, the King of Heaven. And that song includes the line, ransomed, healed, restored, forgiven. We have a God who does. Just think for a moment of your own personal experience of how God has ransomed you, how God has healed you, how God has restored you, how God has forgiven you. These verses from Isaiah 43 have been very apt for churches these last few years. So often we launch into new programs, new structures, and that's often the way of the Salvation Army. They just jump into things. They jump into new plans without stopping and waiting to hear and see what God is doing. Rick Warren in the Purpose-Driven Church likens this to a surfer waiting for the right wave to come so that he might ride its crest. And as we look at the story of the God who does from the past, we are faced with a real challenge. For he says, forget the things of the past, for I am doing a new thing. It is not just that we should put aside the things of the past that have made us who we are. We must remember them. But it is wrong to dwell upon them or to live vicariously through them. God has new things in hand. The Israelites were in despair, yet in the midst of it, God offers words of hope through Isaiah, who comforts the people with truth. He who previously had made a way through the waters will make a way in the wastelands. God is capable. He did it before, and he will do it again. God will do a new thing. He is carving a new way for his people. He calls it a stream in the desert, a road in the wilderness. And in that wilderness, God would make a road. Running through the desert would be life-giving water. Now, we might never experience an actual desert wilderness, but haven't we all been through times in our lives when our faith has felt empty, dry, barren, and lifeless? Have you never experienced dangerous moments when your faith was so fragile it felt as if wild animals were sniping at your heels and that big black dog of depression threatened to overwhelm you? Have you never experienced abject loneliness? And at such moments, God says, I will provide. We're told that reflection is good for the soul. And as you look back over your life, you, like me, will know that the times when there has been no one else to turn to, God has been there. When there has been absolutely nothing left in the cupboards or in the purse, God has given. And why does God do this? It's because we matter to him, for he created us. Our Father's idea of a perfect day is to spend it with us, giving and giving and giving again. Our Bible reading was to verse 21, but it's the next verse that challenged the children of Israel, and this is the verse to challenge us today. In it, God says to his people, "Yet you have not asked me." This promise to provide us for our needs us to be confident enough in God, to trust him sufficiently as a keeper of his word, to ask him. Many years ago, there was a television programme called The Liverbirds, and part of this theme tune was based at a nightclub where one man asked one of the characters to dance. And she said, "Are you asking?" And he said, "I'm asking." So here then is our challenge for us to consider today. Do we miss out on God's provision because we fail to ask for it? Are you asking questions our God? Well, are we? And how confident are we that our God who does will provide?